Still to come on News 4, a 9-acre message of sadness and hope on the ellipse. We'll tell you about that. It's called the Names Project, the enormous quilt made up of panels containing the names and life stories of AIDS victims. Thousands came to the ellipse today for a dramatic unveiling, and News 4's Marjorie Margolis was there.
It took up almost the whole ellipse, 8,288 3-by-6-foot panels, each telling the personal story of someone who died of AIDS. The quilt memorializes thousands of people who died alone and rejected, as well as many who were helped by communities that cared. The Names Project began in San Francisco in 1987. Since then, it's become a nationwide effort, which within the past year and a half has toured 20 cities. Spreading the panel out on the ellipse was the highlight of the tour. There is a panel to Rock Hudson, done by Doris Day. A glittering sequin-filled panel to Liberace. A Marabou-laced one dedicated to 5 members of the cast of La Cage aux Folles who all died of AIDS. Stan Spector was an actor and a dancer. When he turned 30, he decided he'd tackle medical school. Just months before graduation, he died.
I feel closer to him here than I do when I go to the cemetery. I go there and, we look at each other, what are we doing here? He's not here. But he's here with everyone else in the same boat. It's like a battlefield with bodies strewn all over unnecessarily.
We feel the rest of the world should know that AIDS will be the scourge of the 20th century unless we do something about it.
Throughout the day, each name on each panel was read aloud. For those who have worked so hard to make the quilt a reality, this is all about caring. 395,000 square feet, 9 acres. The ellipse is 14 acres. The fear is that soon that space will be too small for the ever-growing quilt. Marjorie Margolis, News 4, Washington.
The grounds near the Washington Monument today were blanketed by a lasting tribute to AIDS victims. An enormous quilt measuring some 150,000 square feet was unfurled by friends and relatives of people who have died of the deadly disease. The panels bear the names of victims. Organizers of the tribute say the quilt is intended to show that AIDS isn't just something we read about. There have been 51,000 cases of the disease reported across the country.
Still ahead on News 11 at 6.
AIDS were remembered today at an emotional ceremony in Washington. For the second straight year, a huge quilt bearing their names was spread out near the White House. As the number of AIDS victims has grown, so has the quilt. And Terrence Smith reports.
They began unfolding the quilt at dawn. 8,288 panels, each in memory of an AIDS victim. The quilt covers 9 acres, 5 times the size it was last year, testimony to the deadly march of a disease that has killed 41,000 Americans and affected 32,000 others. For tens of thousands who came to the ellipse during the long day, it was a chance to lock hands and hearts, to embrace, to ease the pain of loss.
When you come to see the quilt and you look at the colors and the artistry of it, you really feel the love. You feel the people, you feel their lives, you feel the relationships that they built in the course of those lives, and how many Americans are touched by the disease, who may not have it, but whose lives have been changed by losing someone.
From dawn till dusk, the victims' names were read by mothers and brothers and lovers and friends, the sound rolling up to the doors of the White House.
AIDS activists say that the Reagan administration has been slow to recognize the threat posed by the disease and slower still to respond. But just this week, in an admittedly modest step, President Reagan signed a bill that will provide $15 million for grants for drugs to treat AIDS patients.
Some find that hypocritical.
If this had happened to an affluent heterosexual segment of our society, they wouldn't have been so slow to get off the stick in terms of, and red tape would disappear.
In the meantime, the quilt keeps growing. Terrence Smith, CBS News, Washington.
Those who marched tonight marched with hearts heavy with the knowledge that there is no cure for this disease that has killed or is killing their loved ones. The numbers of those infected and dying continue to grow at an alarming rate. Earlier today, thousands brought the National AIDS Memorial back to Washington. They gathered near the White House to dramatize the problem, and Channel 5's Brian Wilson was there.
Bob, sir. Richard Romo. Thousands gathered this morning in the crisp autumn air to participate in an emotional ceremony. Dressed in white, working in silence, volunteers reverently began unfolding the hundreds of massive quilts. The quilts are works of art, but also a memorial. More than 8,000 names embroidered into the fabric. Each represents a person who has been claimed by the AIDS epidemic. After all the quilts were displayed, workers and observers stopped briefly. Hand in hand, they formed a ring within the ellipse. The stillness of the morning interrupted only by the sound of victims' names being read.
Dennis Bittner, Rick Cochran.
Later, 16 miles of canvas walkways gave the general public access to the quilts. This National AIDS Memorial is 4 times larger than the quilt displayed in Washington just 1 year ago. Yet it represents about 1/5 of the 42,000 Americans who have been claimed by AIDS so far. Part of the idea here is to show the magnitude of the AIDS problem in America. But many come here to pay tribute to those loved ones they have lost.
Everybody who is here is really here to share in their loss, what we've all been through with friends, and how we're going to get through this crisis is to hold each other through it.
It was especially emotional for Pete Ferreira, who followed the quilt to Washington for several reasons.
And I've lost quite a few friends. Their panels are here, and came to remember them, to remember everybody who is here. I was diagnosed HIV positive, so who knows what goes from there. So for me, it's a little emotional.
While the quilts are beautiful, they represent a tragic reality. With no cure for AIDS on the immediate horizon, the patchwork will only continue to grow. Brian Wilson, Channel 5 News.
Jeffrey Cole, Richard Harris, Donald E. Gray.
It covered the green with names of friends, lovers, sons, brothers, children. Lives pieced together, death woven into a blanket statement.
As a person of AIDS myself, I can foresee in the future date my name being added to the list. And it's time for people to show more compassion and love and find a cure for this thing.
Harry Ross, Ray Rogers.
Names were read, friends' panels found. A chance to touch a life that touched ours.
I've lost friends. It affects everyone, one way or the other. Someday, somehow.
Roger, James, Hope, Dennis, Shaw.
With the White House as a backdrop, the names were read.
I can't imagine either of these two candidates, either Michael Dukakis or George Bush, ignoring this issue once they take up residence in the Oval Office.
The quilt has now been shown in 25 cities across the country. Unfortunately, in the past 12 months, 20,000 names have been added to it. The quilt is now 5 times the size it was just last year.
It covers about 150,000 square feet, and still there are more panels to be made.
I didn't want to start mentioning them while I was doing the list reading. I would have gone on so long. Yeah, I lost an awful lot of good friends.
The Names Project began with one man's need to memorialize the friend he lost to AIDS. Cleve Jones now has hundreds of friends whose lives are wrapped up in the quilt.
This isn't what I expected to do with my 30s. It was to spend time working with AIDS. I mean, this is the World War II of my generation, and this is what I'm going to. This is going to be the best thing I do in my life.
Mike Bradley, Kent Warner, Robert Phillips, Clint Humble.
I feel closer to him here than I do when I go to the cemetery.
Throughout the day, each name on each panel was read aloud.
It's a collection of very, very personal tributes. It's a celebration of people's lives rather than their death.
Today, it covered 395,000 square feet, 9 acres. The ellipse is 14 acres. The fear is that soon 14 acres will be too small for the ever-growing quilt. Marjorie Margolis, News 4, Washington.
That quilt will be on display again tomorrow from 8 in the morning until 5 tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow evening, there will be a special benefit at the Kennedy Center remembering AIDS victims from the performing arts.
Here in Washington today, a repeat performance of an observance first held a year ago in honor of the victims of AIDS. A giant quilt, each patch representing a person killed by the epidemic, was laid out on the grounds behind the White House. As Kathleen Dulaski reports, the quilt is bigger, much bigger, than it was a year ago.
At daybreak, they began unfolding the quilt, piece by piece on the monument grounds, and in the background, the roll call of names began.
Michael Magme Johnson.
Alva Ellsworth spoke her husband's name out loud, the first time in public since he died of AIDS. She made this quilt with her kids. It helped to ease the pain.
It was the first part of the healing for the three of us, and it's been over a year now, and it's made a big difference to us.
There are now more than 8,000 panels on this quilt. Each one tells a story. Together, they symbolize an epidemic. The quilt is 5 times larger than it was a year ago when it was first displayed here in Washington. It's been on a tour of 20 cities, and it's back here now as a pre-election day message. The motto of the project is "See the quilt and understand." The group wants the next administration to understand that the AIDS statistics are real people. There are famous names on this quilt, like Rock Hudson's and Sequins, of course, for Liberace. But thousands are made famous here, like Michael J. Levy on a patch made by his parents.
When I finished, I cried. There's tear marks on it.
I think the reason we do this is to try to set an example so that other parents won't reject their children, particularly when they find out they're gay and they have AIDS.
The hope is to keep sewing on names. By next year, this labor of love may not fit on the lawn in front of the White House. Kathleen Dulaski.